Okay, I don't want to take more time from Rabbi Shulman. Needs no introduction. Rabbi in St. Louis has got 1 foot out the door, or I shouldn't say that's 1 foot in the door of Israel. Please God, will be making Aliyah at the end of this year, of the school year, I guess, in the summer. And it's a pleasure to have him. On Parshat Noach, was the flood a success or a failure? Let's find out. Vakasha.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kelman, and thank you very much for everybody for joining us. A big shout out to my parents and my father-in-law and family who are joining the call this evening. So thank you. And we are going to start right away. Um, I'm going to share, Rabbi Kelman, can you share on the chat the link to the sources? Is that on the website yet?
I'm going to check. We had an issue getting up. I'm going to check right now, and I'll put it up. I hope.
If not, I think I should be able to do this from, no, I can't share a file on the computer. So if we can, otherwise I have to take a moment and get that onto Google Drive, which we can do. Sorry, we're just going to make a moment.
Okay, it's not up yet, but we'll see.
All
We'll
right, so I will solve that problem, but that requires me to take an extra second of preparation. All right. Okay, we are good to go. I'm not sure this is going to work, but we're going to try. Let's see. Everyone in the meeting, if you can click on that link and see if a PDF opens up, that would give you the source file. If not, I'll share it with you on the screen. Okay, first person to tell me they got it wins a prize. They got it? All right, excellent. So keep an eye on that chat box if you don't mind, somebody, just in case people come on in the middle of this year. And if the boxes went to a different size and I became very big and everybody else became very small, just go up to the right-hand side of the top of the screen where it says View and change that to View Gallery. And that will put you back where everybody is of equal size. That's my housekeeping. Let's join. Let's go. All right, I'm going to try something new tonight. Let's see if this works. All right. Can everybody see my sources and see me in front of the page? You see the sources and you see me, a little picture of me in the front of the page?
we
Excellent.
do.
This
It's
is
like
Yes, yes.
it looks like we're in the 17th century or the
Yes.
22nd century. I'm not sure which one. You know.
okay. But as long as you can see me in front of the screen, we're good. All right. We are starting Parshat Noach. So every year I come to Parshat Noach and I have this deliberation. What part of the Parsha to deal with? The flood or the Tower of Babel? There's so much going on in the Parsha. However, the truth is that the story really begins at the end of the previous Parsha. The story begins at the end of Parshat Breshit, really only picks up in the middle. And so I really want to start from the very beginning and ask the question from the perspective of what was the purpose of bringing the flood? Why did God decide to bring the flood? And only when we recognize and understand why God decided to bring the flood can we then go to the next question, which is to ask, okay, was it successful or was it not successful? And who's right? What if it was successful, then what were the consequences? And if it wasn't successful, then why wasn't? Why not? And that's essentially the question that I want to start with. It sounds like an odd question to ask. How could God do something that was not successful? But I'll show you what I mean by that question. And actually, I want to start with that. Actually, I'm gonna start from the website. This is a website I use often for teaching. It's called alhatorah.org, and it has lots of things. But for our purposes, it has the text of Chumash and a translation side by side. And if I look in Breshit Perek Vav, which is where the story of the flood begins, and I'm going to come back to these psukim and read them through in detail, but I want to look at this pasuk Hey for a moment. Vayar Hashem ki rabba ra'at adam ba'aretz. God saw that man's evil was great upon the earth. V'chol yetzer machshavot libo rak kol hayom. And all of the desires of his heart were evil all day. It's a loose translation. We'll come back to that a little bit later. So God saw that man was essentially evil. And because of that, Vayinachem Hashem ki asat adam, he regretted that he made man. He was going to destroy civilization, destroy mankind, destroy the animals, start from new. Noach matzachem ben Hashem, but of course you have Noach, who found favor in the eyes of God, and therefore we will save mankind through Noach and his family. That's more or less where it starts. And I want to point this phrase that God saw, ki rabba ra'at adam ba'aretz, that man's evil was great upon the earth, and therefore kol yetzem machshavot libo rak kol hayom, his desires of his heart were evil all day long, therefore he brought the flood. Fine. Flood is done. Chapter 6 is the introduction. Chapter 7, chapter 8 is the flood itself. And then after, God enables Noach to leave the Teva. And as he does, Noach makes at the end of the flood, he brings certain offerings and he built a Mizbeach. And then we find the following pasuk. Vayarach Hashem et reach hanichoach. This is after the flood. God accepted the offering, smelt the burnt offering, whatever that means. And God said the following. Vayomer Hashem alibo. Lo osif l'kalel od et adama ba'avur ha'adam. I will never again curse the ground on account of man. Ki yetzer leiv ha'adam ra min urav. Because the desires of his heart are evil all from his youth. And therefore I will never again bring a flood. Now, I don't know if you ever stop to recognize or to see the contrast, but if I put these two psukim side by side, I end up with the following. Okay, these are the two psukim side by side. Okay, this is Perek Vav, Pasuk Hey, and Perek Chet, Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Before the flood, God saw that man's desires of his heart were evil all day long, and therefore decided to destroy civilization. Vayinachem Hashem ki asat adam. And after the flood, God said, I will never again bring a flood because man's desires of his heart are evil all day long from his youth. So, if I understand this correctly, is the Torah saying that, well, there's no point in bringing the flood because nothing's changed? Man before the flood, the desires of his heart were evil. Man after the flood, the desires of his heart were evil, and therefore there's no point? Is that what the pasuk has said? And if that's not what the pasuk intended to say, then I come back to the question, which is, what is the meaning of this phrase? Yetzer machshavot libo rak kol hayom. The desires of his heart are evil, and after the flood, the desires of his heart are evil from his youth, from a young age. So suddenly the same phrase tells me why God brought the flood and tells me why God will never bring another flood, as if almost to imply that, it didn't work? I'm confused. So does everybody understand the question? This is essentially the setup for the question that I want to ask, which is why God brought the flood in the first place, what changed, and what is the consequences for us after the flood is over. So let's start with the first question. Why did God bring the flood altogether? So I want to start with these psukim in Perek Vav, and let's go to the text itself with the translation. It'll be easier. So this is the story. And again, this starts last week's parsha. Even the Parshat Noach starts in Pasuk Tet, but we've picked the starting Parshat Noach and Pasuk Tet was picked up in the middle of the story. So let's go back to the beginning. As man began to multiply upon the earth, uvanot yuladu lahem, and daughters were born to them. So now I have men and I have women, and Vayir'u v'nei ha'Elohim et benot ha'adam. And this is where first part of our shir is going to focus. What is this phrase? The B'nei HaElohim, which if I translate it literally seems to, well, I'm not even sure I can translate it literally. Right? What the B'nei HaElohim, the sons of God, whatever that means. Right? What does that mean? Saw the daughters of man, ki tovotena, that they were beautiful, and vayikhu lehem nashim, they took wives. But they didn't take wives the way we take wives, courting and meeting each other and getting to know each other. They took women, whoever they chose. What does that mean? Okay, so let's go one step further. Skip Pasuk Gimel for now, not our subject. Let's get back to Gan Eden story. I'm going to skip that for now. Hanifilim hayu ba'aretz. There were great people of stature and power in the earth. Bayamim ahem. V'gam achreichen, and afterwards. Asher yavo b'nei ha'Elohim el benot ha'adam. When this b'nei ha'Elohim would take the daughters of man, v'yaladu lahem, and they bore children. Hema giborim asher mi'olam anshe Shem. These were the mighty ones of old, men of renown, power. Vayar Hashem ki rabara at adam ba'aretz v'cho yetzem machshavot libo rak ra kol hayom. And that's when God saw the evil of man that was great, and the desires and designs of his heart evil all day long. So whatever this verse refers to, it has something to do with what we've just described in the two psukim above. And continues the text, Vayinachem Hashem ki asa et ha'adam ba'aretz v'yitatzev libo. God regretted that he made man with pain to the heart. And Vayomer Hashem, he said, Imchet adam asher barati mi'al pnei adama. I will just wipe out man who I created. Adremes ve'adov hashamayim ki nichamti ki asitim. I regret that I made them. But Noach matzachein b'nei Hashem. But we have to stop and recognize that Noach found favor in the eyes of God, and that's where Parshat Bereshit ends. But Noach is an unknown commodity. Who is Noach? And so the Torah stops and says, okay, new story is going to begin, but we're going to pick up where we left off. Meaning, now, Eila Toldot Noach. There's much to say about the phrase Eila Toldot, not our subject for today. But Eila Toldot Noach, Eila Toldot is the structure of all of Sefer Bereshit. This is the story of Noach. Noach is tzaddik, tamimay abadoratav. He was righteous, faultless in his generation. He walked with God. He had 3 sons, Shem, Cham, and Yafet. But vatishachet haaretz lifnei Elohim vatimalei haaretz chamas. But the world had become corrupt before God, and the world was filled with chamas. Chamas is typically defined as violence, wrongdoing, but we'll see it refers specifically to stealing, thievery. Interestingly, the Targum translates Hamas as kidnapping, chatufin. There's all kinds of different ways to translate it, but some kind of violence that corrupted civilization. Vayar Elokim, or Vayar Elokim et haaretz v'nei nishchata. God saw the earth that it was corrupt. Ki shchit kol basar et darko al haaretz. Man had corrupted his way upon the earth. And so he said to Noach, I'm going to destroy the world. The world has become filled with this wrongdoing, with this evil, with this violence. I'm going to destroy them. You make an ark to save yourself, etc. And the animals, I'm going to skip all of that. And at the beginning of Perek Zion, God comes to him and he says, okay, time to enter into the Teva. So there are lots of explanations or descriptions of Noach. Noach is described here as a tzaddik. He's described above as tzaddik tamim. And in last week's parasha, in the end of Parshat Bereshit, he's described as matzachein b'nei Hashem. And you can tell the play on the word between Noach and Chain, but Noach matzachein b'nei Hashem. Who are these b'nei Elohim that are taking the daughters of man and having children that are warriors and men of stature and Nephilim and Anshe Shem. What is going on? This is the description of the events that lead to the decision to bring the flood. Now, there are those, and to be fair, there are those amongst in the commentaries in the Rishonim and Achronim who take the phrase B'nai Elohim quite literally. And it becomes very problematic for us theologically to do so. But to be honest, there are those who do. Shadal, for example, says, it quotes a tradition, Dat Ktsat Mina Kadmonim. Some of the early commentaries suggest that this is a reference to some kind of angels that who are called B'nai Elohim, for example, in the book of Eov. And for those of you who may have been in the shir when I studied, we did Parshat Vayera a couple of years ago, we talked about Eov as being contemporary to the book of Breshit. The reference to B'nai Elohim appears in the book of Eov as well. Maybe. Similarly, Radat Hoffman suggests that there may be a reference to B'nai Elohim, meaning B'muvan shel Yitzurim Elohim, some sort of angel, some sort of being outside of the physical being of world that we live in, that tried to engage and merge with human beings, and what we refer to in mythology as demigods. It becomes very complicated and very problematic. There is such an opinion. I acknowledge that it exists. I'm not comfortable with it. I don't think it's pshat. What I do think is pshat is along the lines of what all the major line of thinking in the Rishonim, Rashi, Rashbam, Chazal in the Medrash Rabbah, who suggest that B'nai Elohim refers to, the word Elohim is a fascinating word. We refer to it as a word for God when we say Elohim. We refer to it as a word for idolatry when we say Avodah Zarah or Elohim Acherim. But in Chumash, the word Elohim means another thing as well, which is it's a reference to people of power or people of stature or judges. B'nei Shoftei Haaretz, says Rashbam, the sons of the judges, meaning the leaders of the land. Or Rashi's translation, B'nei Hasarim Behashoftim, sons of princes and rulers. In other words, the word Elohim can refer to in the same fashion, in the same context as it's referred to, for example, in Shemot Perek Chav Bet, where it talks about the word Elohim referring to judges and the constitution of the composition of a court, a Beit Din. If one person stole from another, and they come, the owner of that which was stolen comes to the court, comes to V'nikra B'Bayit El HaElohim, and he takes an oath before the judges, Adolim Yavod Vashnehem, and the Gemara in Sanhedrin learns from that source the reference to Elohim in those psukim 3 times, that is why we need 3 minimally for a Beit Din. In other words, the word Elohim in this context, or B'nai Elohim, means the sons of people of stature and power. And power being the operative term here for a society in which power has, or might makes right, for which power has now become the criteria by which society is beginning to grow. Look at Rashi. Vatishachet, as the world became corrupted, which is the language in Parshat Noach, right, our Parsha. Rashi says, Lashon erva va'avodah zarah. The word Vatishachet refers specifically to lewdness, erva, crimes, sexual crimes, and idolatry crimes. Now, the idolatry is based on the fact that there's a reference to B'nai Elohim here, but I think the erva is more appropriate, more powerful here, because what he's saying is that the fact that these B'nai Elohim took these wives by force, Mikol Asher Bacharu, by dint of their power, created a crime by virtue of the fact that the Torah is describing essentially a crime of power of the mighty sons of the leaders against the women of the generation. Hence Rashi says that V'tishachet refers to erva. And Vatimilea Aretz Chamas takes it one step further and says Rashi that it's referring to Hamas refers to gezel, thievery, but not just ordinary thievery. And we're not talking about people who stole $50, $100, $1,000, $100,000 from the bank. Says Unklus that this phrase, Vatishachet Aretz, means Vitmal Ara Hamas or Chatufin, kidnapping. Thievery meaning stealing people. We've moved from taking the wives who they want, and we've defined that not just in terms of power, abuse of power or power imbalance, but we've defined it now in terms of literally stealing these women. Gezel, chatufin. And suddenly the world has become filled with a kind of corruption that can only happen when the control is in the hands of the Bnei Elohim, the people of power, and the people who are weaker have no defense, and they're taking Benot HaAdam, Kitovotena, Mikol Shebacharu, whoever they want, whoever they choose, and that's the society that's been created. That says the Parsha in Parshat Noach, that is Vatishachet Haaretz, says Rashi. That's exactly what is being described when we describe the world become corrupted. The very crime described in the beginning of this, the end of Parsha Breshit, is the crime that Rashi points to when he says Vatishachet Haaretz, Vatimaleh Haaretz Chamas, Erva, Varazora, and Gezel. And these men of stature and power kidnapping women and taking who they want, and the sexual violence and the violence of other kinds and thievery and kidnapping, and before you know it, there is a complete breakdown of all norms of society. And so God comes and says, the only way to solve this problem is to reboot. And that's what he does. That's how Rashi presents it. And the notion that taking wives by force rather than by choice, and violence that involves that ensues, that's not new to us. We've seen that throughout Tanakh, right? What does King of Egypt do when Avram and Sarah come down to Mitzrayim? Right? Take Sarah by force. What does Avimelech do when Rivka and Yitzchak come down to Gerar? Takes by Shechem, and the story of Dinah, the people of Sodom, and their guests. You could go all the way up to the story of David to David and Bathsheba. It's more complicated. The notion that there is a potential for violence that emerges from an abuse of status of power when it comes to sexual crimes, this is not. Right? We've seen this since the beginning of civilization. That's precisely what the Torah says is described here. Well. Okay, so let's stop here for a moment and ask the question with which I started. If that was the state of the world by which God decided to bring about the flood, was the flood a success or a failure? What is the state of the world today? And is it much better than that description of these psukim at the end of Perek Vav? And I leave that as an open question. I'm not looking to answer it. I just put that out there. And if this is the description of the chet that led to the Mabul, that chet still exists and is still rampant in society and in civilization today. And that's the first part of the question. Was the flood a success? The second part of the question comes to the conclusion of the flood, which is in this pasuk in chapter 8, in which God says, okay, I will never again bring a flood. Why? Because the desire of man's heart are evil from his youth. What does that mean? Does that imply what I think it implies? That man is inherently evil? And therefore, there's nothing I can do to change it? Which is what the story was in Perek Vav. God said, man is inherently become evil and corrupt. We're going to start all over again. Now the story is over 2 chapters later, and God says, oh, I'm not going to bring a flood again. Why not? Because man is still corrupt and corruptible. So what have I accomplished? That clearly can't be the message of the Torah. The Torah wouldn't go out of its way to describe the entire story of the flood just to be able to conclude that Garnish would help and it didn't help. So we need to examine this. This is now going to be the jumping point for our discussion. What does this phrase mean? The pasuk says, "Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra minurav," that man's desires of his heart are evil from his youth, and therefore God just says, "I will not bring a flood." Again, what have we accomplished? Sorry, I just moved my chair and gave myself a cramp in my leg, and I apologize for that. That was not intended. Okay. So we are going to move to part 2 of this discussion, which is to understand this phrase, Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra minurav. What does that mean, and why does it mean what I think it means, which is that man is inherently evil from his youth? It's a very difficult concept to understand. This is after the flood. This is God accepts the korban, and God is Kaviyachol smiling down on Noach. And he says, God says to him, to his heart, I will never again curse the world. I will never again bring a flood. Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra minurav. For the man's designs of his heart are evil from his youth. Why is that a reason not to bring the flood? That was the reason to bring the flood. So I'm confused. So to take this, to break this down, we need to start with the question of what this phrase means. This is going to be the key linchpin upon which we are going to develop this, the thought for this conclusion of the shir today. Yetzer lev is a phrase we are very familiar with. Anybody who's ever come across the phrase Yetzer, desire, Yetzer Tov, a good desire, Yetzer Rab, evil desire. It's a phrase that is ubiquitous throughout the writings of Chazal. Gemara and Sukkah, Darash Rabbi Avira, V'Temed Rabbi Shulman Levi. There's 7 names for the Yetzer Hara. What we call the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination within us, says the Gemara, has 7 different names. God calls it Ra. HaKadosh Baruch Hu kra'o Ra. God called the evil inclination evil. What pasuk tells me that? Shneimar ki yetzer lev adam rani minurav, because the inclinations of man's heart is evil from his youth. So right away, it's clear that in the Gemara and Sukkah, at least, Chazal understood this phrase yetzer lev referring to the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination. And now all the questions that we can ask, that theological questions, philosophical questions, man's free will, is the implication that man is inherently born evil. I have a hard time accepting that, but that seems to be the implication of that statement. And the other names given to the Yetzer Hara and the Gemara, I'm going to skip that for now, not our issue. There's another phrase that appears in the Sifrei that also connects this pasuk, Ki yetzer lev adam ra minurav, the yetzer of man's heart is evil from his youth, to the what we call the Yetzer Hara. It's a Sifrei. Rahu Yetzer Hara. Evil is the Yetzer Hara. Shemi shebarauto me'id alav shehu ra. Because even its creator, meaning God, testifies that the evil inclination is evil. And that's quoted in the Gemara in Bavli, in Kedushin, Tanu Rabbanan, Kashe Yetzara, Shafilu Yotzlo Karara. What is this notion, this evil, this, we have this image. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second. We have this impression that this, I don't know about you, I always grew up with this idea that you have a Yetzer HaTov and a Yetzer Hara, and they battle each other out inside my heart, inside my head. And we all have this image, which is very physical, very, this little, the conscience and the good guy and the bad guy sitting on my shoulders, having a battle with me about whether I should or I shouldn't do this, right? Should I get up? Right? And it's a very physical, almost external concept, as if there's a Yetzer Tov in me and there's a Yetzer Hara in me. There are voices that are struggling with me, that are trying to convince me to do the right thing or the wrong thing. I don't know, but it's never sat well with me to describe the concept of free will, which is essentially what we're describing, as a battle between two voices. We can describe it as a battle between the physical self and the spiritual self, the desire for physical pleasures versus the desire to be spiritual and reach above, outside of ourselves. That maybe that's the battle of the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. But to describe this notion that the Yetzer Hara is inherently Ra, and God says, Yetzer Ra, Yetzer Lev Adam Ra Minurav, the inclination of man's heart is evil from his youth. That is an extraordinarily difficult verse to process, especially given that it's in the context of after the flood. And there are those who are quite uncomfortable with that idea. So, for example, let's go back to, I'm assuming you're still seeing source page and me, right? Okay. There is a Gemara, for example, that took a slightly different approach to what we call the Yetzer Hara. Gemara says, Amrish Lakish, who's Satan, right? What we call Satan. Right? We all have that image of the little devil sitting on our shoulder, right? Who's Satan? Who Yetzer Hara? That's the evil inclination. Who Malach HaMavos? That's the angel of death. And they're all one. Meaning that they're not literal, they're simply phrases that describe some concept in terms of negative decisions that prompt the Adam and Chava, that push them out of Gan Eden and brought death into the world. We can unpack that in many ways. When I start to go back to this verse, I'm still struggling with the translation of this phrase that I'm satisfied with. Ki yetzer lev adam ra minurav. Man's inclination of his heart is evil from his youth, and therefore man is inherently evil. There's no, right? What does that mean? If I look at the classic translations of the Chumash into English, and here I intentionally start with the King James Bible, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. That seems to be exactly what he says. That because man is in evil from his youth, his desires, his imaginations, his strivings are evil, therefore God will never bring a flood. The implication is that he'll never bring a flood because it didn't help. Man is still evil. He was evil before the flood, and now he's evil after the flood, so it won't help. So what have we accomplished? Again, you understand the question. The whole shiur is going to be this giant question until the last few minutes. We'll try to resolve it. Sensina has a slight variation, but not much. The Lord smelled the pleasing odor. The Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Hertz commentary, Hertz Chumash spells it out again in the evil inclination of man, Yetzer Hara, he says it explicitly, which too often gains the mastery over the good inclination, the Yetzer Tov, from his youth, from the dawn of his knowledge of good and evil. So that's the first slight variation of the interpretation, meaning Hertz makes the interesting suggestion that minurav doesn't mean from the youth of the person, meaning from our young age. There is a tradition that a person until the bar mitzvah only has a yetzer ra, and that after the bar mitzvah is imbued with the yetzer tov. I don't know if you've heard that tradition or not. There is such tradition. It comes from this idea that minurav, from one's youth, one has yetzer tov, yetzer ra. And then after they're old enough to understand intellectually the difference between good and evil, right, between right and wrong, when they start to mature, so then they are imbued with the Yetzer Tov. So Hertz kind of looks at that from a perspective of the youth, not of an individual, but of civilization. From the dawn of civilization, from the youth of humankind, dawn of his knowledge of good and evil, almost like the Gan Eden context, That's when Yetzer Ra begins. I'm gonna more or less the rest of the other Mefarshim, Ramban and the Chizkuni, variations on a theme, but they all come to the same idea. The Ramban says that why is that a reason not to destroy the world? He ascribes merit to men because by their very creation they have an evil nature in their youthful days, but not in their mature days. And because the Yetzer Ra is only in their youth, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt to allow them to mature. Maybe they'll do the right thing as they get older. That's the way the Ramban interprets the verse. Chizkuni, man's immaturity in his younger years is the reason for these evil inclinations. God therefore decided not to visit punishments on man promptly as a result of this consideration, as he used to do, rather give man the benefit of the doubt. In other words, all of these Mefarshim basically take what I would call the classic reading of the text, that man has an evil inclination, a Yetzer Ra that comes from his youth, and that God becomes more tolerant of man and tolerant of man's mistakes and tolerant of man's errors, because eventually man might mature and there might eventually be a growing up and realizing, and therefore we're not going to destroy the world because we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. So why did God brought the entire flood to enable this realization that maybe we should give mankind the benefit of the doubt, and if he stumbles back into the same kind of evil with which it began, we're gonna not destroy. And I'm keep circling back to the same question because I'm uncomfortable with the notion that the flood could have been a failure. That God looked at the world and said, well, man hasn't changed. We're going to chalk it all up to immaturity and hope man will mature and therefore we're not going to bring another flood. So the truth is that the interpretation of this text that I found most compelling for me, and that I think takes this whole approach and this whole sentence into a completely different light, is that of Shimshon Ufal Hirsch. And the reason I put this all together really to highlight how critical is this interpretation of Hirsch and how it changes the whole meaning of what the flood story was about. And the first thing Rav Hirsch points out is that you have to separate the language of Tanakh from the language of Chazal. And Chazal themselves say this. Lashon chachamim l'chud, lashon mikul l'chud, v'lashon chachamim l'chud. Words change meaning over time. And Chazal used words in a certain way that are different than the way the Tanakh used the same words. I've shared with you in the past examples, very famous examples. For example, the word olam. We refer to olam hazeh, we refer to olam haba, this world, the next world. In Tanakh, the word olam never means world. The word for world in Tanakh is the word tevel. Tevel v'yoshveva. The word olam in Tanakh means eternity, like olam va'ed. So Chazal used it in a very different context. Language changes over time. The word Yetzer in Chumash is different than the word Yetzer in Chazal. Chazal used the word Yetzer to mean desire, the desire of one's heart. But in Tanakh, that's not the meaning of the word. In Tanakh, for example, look at this phrase. Hine kachomer biyad hayotzer. Ken atem biyadi bet Yisrael. Just as clay in the hands of the potter, so are you in my hand, the house of Israel. Or the phrase in Yeshayahu, V'yetzer amar li yotzro. The work said of him who made it, Lo evini, did not make me. Meaning the word Yetzer in Tanakh means not desire, intent, imagination, creativity, right? That's not what it means. The word Yetzer in Tanakh means that which is created. Yitzira, that which is formed, that which is made. And therefore says, and I want to read you this quote from Rav Hirsch. It's unbelievably powerful. He says the following, and unfortunately, it's a translation of a translation, because the English translation is a translation from the Hebrew, which is a translation from the German. But nonetheless, it says it is unfortunate that this word is so often translated as instinct, inclination, or impulse, as if there was a force in man that drives him to evil. From that there then formed a hopeless view of life on which a great religious society rests, that dogma of the power of evil in which man is supposed to be born, and out of which he can only be saved by a certain belief. Which, of course, is a polemic against Christianity, but that's not my issue. My issue for now is to understand the phrase. So what does the phrase Yetzer mean? And what does the phrase Yetzer machshavot libo? So the truth is, in Chumash, Maaseh choshev, right? Lachshov, in modern Hebrew, lachshov means, right? Lachshov means to think, to imagine. In biblical Hebrew, Maaseh choshev was weaving, is in the melachot of the Mishkan. You took material and you wove it into something. You made it into something. Like the Yetzirah that is created when you do something. Raw materials that are then formed, Maaseh choshev, into some shape or form. So Yetzer machshavot libo, or Yetzer lev ha'adam. Let's go back to the other phrase. Yetzer machshavot libo, says Rav Hirsch, does not mean his inclinations, his desires were evil. It means that which he formed, the formations of his weaving soul, the machinations that he came up with, the creations, the acts of evil that he created were rak oleo. Go back to the psukim with which the Mabul started. The psukim describe the Bnei Elohim taking their wives and their women and by force and abuse of power, and Yetzer machshavot libo, and all of this creation, all of these deeds, not desires, but deeds, actual Yetzirah of the machinations and the weaving of his heart, man's heart was evil. Man had corrupted, and therefore God said, okay, man has corrupted, I will fix it. That's what the Mabul said. Agreed? Now, what happened after the Mabul? God said, I will no longer. I will not curse the earth ever again. Because man is evil. So, or man's evil has deeds are from his youth. So what does that accomplish? What does that help me? So for this, we need part 2 of Hirsch's insight. And that comes to how we translate very simple, small words. And you'll forgive me for getting pedantic, but it's so important in this case. Translations are so sensitive. They can change entire stories by translating one word differently. The word, let's go back to where's this pasuk? Let's go here. God smelled the smooth fragrance and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man. Ki means, I'll translate the word ki.
Who? Because of?
Cause of.
Or maybe? Or maybe?
Insofar as.
Because. It's a 2-letter word. How difficult can it be to translate a 2-letter word? The answer is that it can be very difficult to translate a 2-letter word, especially the word ki, because the Gemara says the word ki is the most versatile preposition in the entire Hebrew language. Gemara identifies no less than 4 different meanings of the same preposition. The Amr Ish Lakish, Ki Mishamesh Ba'arba Lashonot. In 4 different places, I could have the word ki mean 4 different things. It could mean meaning if. It could mean dilma, meaning perhaps. It could mean ella, meaning but. It could mean daha, meaning because. It could mean so many different things. And sometimes in the same verse, it could mean different things. Take a look at this pasuk in Shmos Yud Gimel. Vayibeshalach Paro ta'am v'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim ki karovu ki amar Elohim pen yinachem ma'am b'rotam milchama v'shavu Mitzrayim. When Paro let Israel go, God did not take them via the coastal road, derech eretz plishtim, ki karovu, which can be translated as, although it was the closer route, or because it was the closer route. That's 2 different meanings. Ki, because, Amar Elokim, lest they see war and run back to Mitzrayim. So is the reason the coastal road is closer, is that the reason God didn't take them that route? Or is that God didn't take them that route despite the fact that it was closer? Meaning, is it closer, therefore it's easier to run back to Mitzrayim? Or it's closer, therefore it's faster to get to Israel, but there's another reason not to take them back. You understand the problem? I can take the word ki, and there's so many different ways to break it down, and the Rishonim are split over what it means. So I charted out, here's an interesting chart, for those who like Hebrew grammar. I charted out 5 different, it's based on the Rashi on that Gemara, 5 different uses of the word ki, and there's actually a 6th I'm going to share with you in a moment. The Gemara says 4, but I think it means at least 4. And I'll show you examples. Ki which means if you find your enemy or your friend's ox lost, you should give it back to him. The word ki there means if. It doesn't mean when, because you could go through your entire life and never encounter such a circumstance. But if you encounter the circumstance, this is the rule. This is what you should do. Or ki yikere kansi por lefanecha, if you will encounter a mother bird hovering over its nest and you want to take the eggs, then this is what you should do. Send away the mother bird, etc. It's not when, it's if this happens to come your way. But if I look at Shmos Yud Beit, ve'ya ki tavo el haaretz, doesn't mean if you will come into the land, it means when you will come into the land. Right? Or when you will count Bnei Yisrael, ki tisat rosh Bnei Yisrael. Now, there are other uses of the word ki. For example, ki tamar bilvavcha rabim hagoyim ha'ela mimeni echal ochal ha'isham, lest you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I conquer them? Then, etc. After Shemitah, if, when you will say, lest you will say, what will I eat in the 7th year? This is what will happen. The word ki, and these 2 examples, the last 2 examples I'll share with you before I go back to the subject of our discussion. What I find powerful about this example is that it's the same story. By Sarah, when she laughs, because she overhears the story that she's going to have a child at the age at her age, Vatikachesh Sarah, she denied laughing, lemor lo tzachakti, ki yareah, meaning she denied it because she was afraid. And God said, Vayomer lo, ki tzachakt. No, you indeed laughed. So the word ki in this verse appears twice in 2 different meanings. The first meaning is because she was afraid, and the second meaning is indeed you did laugh. You follow what I'm doing? No, it's this two-letter word has now 5 different translations. Well, there's another translation. And the other translation is afki, meaning even though. Ki karofu. Even though Derech Eretz Plishtim was closer. I didn't take you that route because you might run home to Egypt. Says Rav Hirsch, now let's go back to the story of the flood. Man had created a world which was corrupt. I go back to the beginning of chapter 6, imbalance of power, violence, sexual crimes, avodah zarah. Man had corrupted every domain of civilization. And God took it upon himself to reboot civilization. What happened after the flood? Did Noach and his family fundamentally, inherently change the nature of man? No. And that's what the Pasuk says. Pasuk says, the end of the story, that man is exactly the same as he was before. Not that he's evil from his youth, but man had corrupted the world in a yetzirah of evil. Says the Pasuk, God promises, never again will I bring a flood. Ki, and here this word ki, I would translate the way Rav Hirsch translates it as, even if, af ki, just like by the Derech Eretz Plishtim, ki karovu, even though it was the closer road. Ki, even if man returns to create a world of evil, Yetzer Lev Adam Rami Nurav, even if that is the situation, God says, I will not again bring a flood. Why not? When it did it the first time, why won't God do it the second time? If man corrupted civilization because he was evil, God intervened and God destroyed the world and started again. In this pasuk, God says, I will never again bring a flood, even if man returns to the evil with which we started. Af ki, if a situation arises where the yetzirah, the creations of the human being, are Ramin Rav, are evil from his youth. So what kind of a promise is that? What kind of a word of comfort is that? So for this, we need to go one paragraph further into the next chapter and understand what took place. Vayavarach Elokim, now in the beginning of chapter 9. Vayavarach Elokim et Noach v'et banav v'yom b'lehem. God said to Noach, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and place your dread upon the animals, etc. And you can eat the animals, but you cannot eat the flesh with its blood. Shever mitzvot b'nei Noach is another subject. Your blood, which is your soul, I will hold accountable. And we come to Pasuk Vav. Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishofech. Ki b'tzelem elokim asa'at ha'adam. One of the most powerful psukim because it's a
calendar.
It isn't. It's actually it's a chiasmus, right? It's a shofech dam adam ba'adam damo yishofech. If you wrote it out, you would see it's A B C B A, right? It's a chiasmus. But essentially, it's a powerful phrase that says, if man spills blood, by man shall his blood be spilled. What's the message? Says first, the message is very simply this. God says to Noach and his descendants, I rebooted civilization once. Man corrupted himself, I took care of it. But I'm out of that business. On a global scale, I'm handing this world over to you. And I'm giving you this challenge. Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. If man returns to that Yetzer Lev Adam Raminu Rav, if man returns to the situation where he's created a world in which evil is allowed to form and evil is allowed to exist, who becomes responsible for addressing that evil? Who becomes responsible for curtailing that evil, for stopping it, for holding man accountable? On a small scale, here and there, God says, "I'll deal with the storm and Amorah. We'll deal with an Amalek. I'll deal with it." But on a global scale, Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. God has handed responsibility for civilization and for humankind over to human beings. That's the consequence of the flood. The consequence of the flood was that it was a one-time deal. God said, the world corrupted itself. I'll fix it. But that's it, once. From here forward, I've set the pattern. I've given you the model. God says, now you do as me. If the world has become, if evil is allowed to exist, then you have to address evil. If man spills blood, then by man shall blood be spilled. This is your accountability. And you have to take responsibility for the world that I have given you. And so when I come back to the question of Yetzer Lev Adam Raminu Rav, essentially what the Torah is saying is, the same phrase defines why God created the world. Yetzer Machshavot Libo Rak Kol Hayom. And then that same phrase defines the potential. A world, it's not a guarantee. The flood was not a guarantee that the world would never corrupt itself again. God says, I will never bring a flood again. Doesn't mean that the world will never again reach that level of evil and corruptibility. All God said was, I've handed responsibility over for the world to your hands, your courts. One of the Sheva Mitzvot in Noach was to establish courts system, was to establish a system of law and order, was to hold human beings accountable for their actions, to establish a batei din, and laws that would govern society. That's the civilization, that responsibility that I've created for you. And so even if, gam af ki, says Rav Hirsch, even if man corrupts himself again, Yetzer Lev Adam Raminu Rav, responsibility stays in the hands of man. Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. God takes a step back and says, I will assist, but primary responsibility for the world I have handed over to you, for the world that you are now responsible for. So was the flood a success? Yes, but not because God eradicated evil, but because God set a paradigm for civilization to say, if man becomes evil again, you have to deal with it. You have to address it. You are responsible for civilization, for its courts, for its law and order, and for the fact that ultimately, as the verse ends, recognizing Kivitzelem Elokim Asat Adam, God created man in the image of godliness. Therefore, man has that responsibility now, not solely in the hands of God. That's the takeaway of the Mabul according to Rav Hirsch. I think it's a very compelling interpretation, and I will stop here. And if there are questions, I'd be happy to take questions.
Questions, comments? Okay, well, wait, Rabbi, I just have I missed it. I don't think you mentioned, but the key that I like the best is Ki Gerim Hayitim Be'eretz Mitzrayim. And you'd be nice to the stranger. So most people interpret it because you were strangers in Egypt. But I think it means despite. It also means despite the fact. Because as we know, often people who suffer want to say, I went through it, you can go through it too. So the Torah is saying, be nice to the stranger, despite the fact that you were slaves in Egypt.
Power of the word key. The most versatile two-letter word in all of Tanakh.
Yeah. I just figured. Really okay, now maybe somebody thought of it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Excellent.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi. But it's exactly like Moshe and Hashem said about Bnei Israel, Ki'am Kshe Orefu.
Mhm.
It's exactly
Another one
the
of the
same.
examples, Kiyam Ksheor, not because they are stiff-necked, but despite the fact that they are stiff-necked, right?
But it's very, very parallel what you've done.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Chodesh Tov, Shabbat Shalom.
Chodesh Tov to everybody. Enjoy.
Chodesh Tov. Okay. All right, everybody.
Join us. We'll see you on Tuesday.
Yes, Rabbi Shulman, as I mentioned in the beginning, for those who weren't here, is beginning his series on the Vim Rishonim in less than 10 years. The Vim Rishonim, okay. Sefer Yoshua, please God, this year. That will be Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Also next week, starting new series are Rabbi Liebtag and Rabbi Helfgott. Rabbi Liebtag is the Chumash one book or 5 books. I mean, that's a short synopsis. And Rabbi Liebtag and Rabbi Helfgott Wednesday night on the second half of Sefer Yeshayahu he's going to be doing. So that's next week, plus some of our regular classes. I'll be continuing my class on the Siddur tomorrow morning at 9:15. Rabbi Benny Gesundheit will be continuing his Shiur Bivrit B'Sefer Tilim also on Sundays, and Mark Shapiro is continuing his classes. So we've got a bunch of stuff coming up, and look forward to seeing you soon. Please do invite a friend. You know, now that the holidays are over, I don't know what do people do on Thursday and Friday this week. It is Thursday, you know. Didn't you get ready for Yontif on Wednesday? Like, you know, got all I can't have a whole week without Yontif. But anyways, look forward to learning with you. Please do invite, and everybody should be well. We should hear good news from Israel and from around the world, and B'Sorot Tovot and Chodesh Tov. It should be not a Mar Cheshvan. We should turn it to like a Ram Cheshvan. You know, good events. Okay, everybody. Laila Tov.
Tov, Toda Rabba.
Okay, Rakasha.